Another objection to cultural relativism is that if the view is true, you might have the obligation to be intolerant. Intolerance on the cultural relativist view could be a good thing, could be a virtue. And this is a problem because a lot of people who are cultural relativists endorse the view because they think cultural relativism is the most consistent with the claim that the greatest virtue, the cardinal virtue, is tolerance. And so if those two things don't go together very well, that eliminates one of the reasons that people have for being cultural relativists. Remember, according to the cultural relativist, any act can be right as long as the majority of the culture approves of it. As you'll see with this objection and many other objections, most of them emanate from that initial definition of what makes an act right or wrong. So we have the cultural relativist analysis of moral rightness. An act is right when the majority of the culture approves of it. Given that analysis, anything could be right as long as the majority of the culture approves of it, which means intolerance could be right. In fact, being intolerant could be obligatory as long as the majority in your culture approved of it. So if cultural relativism is true, you might have an obligation to be intolerant, and thus the view doesn't justify this idea that tolerance is the chief virtue. It doesn't even necessarily go with tolerance. If you live in a culture that approves of being intolerant of other cultures, then in your culture, intolerance is a good thing. It's not just that your culture believes that intolerance is a good thing. Intolerance literally is a good thing in your culture. Another objection to cultural relativism is that if the view is correct, your culture, your society's moral code is perfect. Your culture is morally infallible. They can't get anything wrong. They're always right because they are the standard of what is right or wrong. They are the source. They are the fountainhead for that culture of what counts as right and what counts as wrong. If that's the case, if each culture is its own moral standard, and there is no objective standard hovering above them all that we can compare them against and see which code does a better job matching up with that objective standard, if there is no objective standard, then every moral code is equally correct, equally good, equally valid. Now this might sound open-minded, intolerant, and liberating, but if each code is equally good, that means a moral code or a culture in which they approve of the subjugation of women and minorities, they approve of treating them as mere property, that moral code is equally good as a code that recognizes equality and civil rights and has respect for ethnic groups. Once you start to say that every culture is its own moral standard and it determines what's right or wrong for that culture, then you have to be willing to say if a culture goes pretty far in the other direction, is very different from our culture such that they approve of treating women as property, that code is equally good, assuming the truth of cultural relativism. But that's a problem, because when it comes to perhaps trite moral differences, cultural relativism doesn't bother us that much. But when it comes to something like the treatment of women and minorities, it seems like a big difference here is a big deal, that not everyone is right, that some cultures have it right and others have it wrong. Consider this case. There was a 14-year-old girl from Istanbul who, on her way home from the grocery store, was abducted by several men, and she was raped over the course of 6 days. She was finally rescued and found, and her father believed that by being raped, she had dishonored their family. So he killed her. And this is what he said: "I decided to kill her because our honor was dirtied. I didn't listen to her pleas. I wrapped the wire around her neck and pulled it until she died." If cultural relativism is true, then what we have to say is, equally good, equally correct. There's nothing wrong with it. It'd be wrong if he did it in our culture. But hey, who are we to say what's right or wrong? who are we to impose our moral values on them? Of course, if cultural relativism is true, and your culture approves of imposing its moral values on others, then you have the obligation to. Morality for the cultural relativist is in the eye of the beholder. And everyone is going to see things equally well because it's all in the eye. There is no objective moral reality out there that we could either latch onto or fail to latch onto. Morality is in the eye of the culture. Another problem is that even if a culture's moral code is based on bad reasoning, or just plain ignorance, or superficial thinking, or just bias and prejudice, that doesn't affect the quality of that moral code. That moral code is equally good because each moral code is morally infallible because there's no objective standard that it could fail to correspond. But doesn't it seem like a moral code that is the result of ignorance and bias and prejudice, isn't that moral code less likely to be a good one, an appealing one that perhaps is just to the people who have to adhere to that code? Remember, if cultural relativism is true, anything can be right as long as a certain condition obtains. That condition is an act is right when the majority of the culture approves of it. On the cultural relativist view, then, who counts as morally wise? It's not the virtuous person who is the most morally wise. You wouldn't want to go to virtuous people to find out how you ought to behave and what you ought to do. It's not the person who's had a tremendous number of life experiences that they could draw on. They're not the morally wise either. The person who's morally wise is the person who can tell what's right or wrong, and since according to the cultural relativists what makes an act right or wrong has to do with what the society approves or disapproves of, the morally wise person is simply the one who's better attuned to what the society stands for. So it's a person who's better attuned to the current polls, to the current opinion polls. That's the morally wise person. But that doesn't seem quite right either. That's not what we usually think of when we think of the person who can dispense morally wise advice. Since cultural relativism implies that the culture is morally infallible, and the culture never gets anything wrong, you shouldn't ever question the culture. You shouldn't ever question whether what the majority approve of is right, or whether what your culture is doing is right. They're always right. And you shouldn't question, unless your culture approves of it, what's going on in other cultures, because what they approve of is right. Each culture's moral code is equally correct and legitimate. But then, how are we to understand something like the women's suffrage movement, which, at the time, I suppose that the majority didn't approve of acknowledging the rights of a woman to vote. So if that were the case, how could they argue that they ought to be given the opportunity to vote? Because if the majority disapproved of it, it was wrong. And so what they were arguing was they should be allowed to do what is wrong, which isn't a great argument. If they were in the minority point of view, they were just wrong all over the place. Lots of the claims they were making were just mistaken, because if the majority approved of not acknowledging the rights of women to vote, then that was a good thing. That was, in fact, what the morally virtuous person would do. The women in the women's suffrage movement couldn't have argued that this is an injustice, that they're not being able to vote is an injustice against women. There was no injustice. It was morally right. So how would their argument go? How could they couch it in that sort of context without violating the view of the cultural relativist? And if they were cultural relativists, how would their actions make any sense? Since they were basically saying, hey, there's this minority view, and it's the right one, and we need to acknowledge it. And finally, what if the expression might doesn't make right? That's a trite expression, probably one you've heard before. The idea is just because someone's in the majority or they have the most power, that doesn't mean what they do is automatically right. But if cultural relativism is true, the majority is always right. And in that case, doesn't it follow that might does make right?